Now we move into transformation. The story becomes less about dreams and more about formation. At this point in the story, something decisive happens. Niggle is taken on a journey he has always known was coming, but for which he feels completely unprepared. The key detail here is not simply that the journey begins, it begins suddenly. Niggle does not get extra time to finish his work. He does not get to organize his plans or resolve all his responsibilities. He is taken as he is. This moment introduces a powerful worldview theme. Human life has limits. No matter how important our projects seem, no matter how much we believe we still have time, there comes a moment when our ability to control our schedule, our priorities, and our unfinished work ends. The story is asking us to consider an uncomfortable question. What happens when we are called to account before we feel ready? From a Christian worldview perspective, this journey can symbolize mortality and moral accountability. Human beings do not simply drift into eternity. They are summoned. They must answer for how they have lived, not only for what they accomplished, but for how they loved, served, and ordered their lives. Notice also how Niggle's fear is connected to unfinished work. He worries about what he has not completed. But the story is beginning to suggest that the deeper issue is not whether the painting is finished, it is whether Niggle himself is prepared. As we continue reading, watch carefully for how this journey begins to shift his understanding of success, responsibility, and what truly matters. When Niggle arrives at the workhouse, everything changes. Up to this point in his life, Niggle has been able to structure his days around his own desires and preferences. Even when he procrastinated or avoided responsibilities, he still had a sense of personal control. But in the workhouse, that control is taken away. Life now operates under strict order. There are schedules, expectations, clear authority. Niggle cannot decide what he will do or when he will do it. His time is no longer his own. This experience creates a profound loss of control. For someone who had centered his identity on a personal artistic vision, this feels limiting and even unsettling. He is forced to confront the reality that he is not the ultimate authority over his life. There is also no recognition. In his former life, even if his painting was unfinished, it still mattered deeply to him. It gave him a sense of purpose and distinction. In the workhouse, however, his efforts are not celebrated. His work is ordinary, repetitive, and unnoticed. From a worldview perspective, this setting begins to expose an important truth. Human beings often attach their sense of worth to achievement, creativity, or public acknowledgement. When those things are removed, deeper questions surface about identity and meaning. Yet this environment is not simply punitive. It becomes formative. Through structure, discipline, and limitation, Niggle begins to develop humility, responsibility, and attentiveness. The workhouse represents a process of shaping, a kind of moral and spiritual training that prepares him for what comes next. As you continue reading, look for subtle changes in Niggle's attitudes and concerns. Ask yourself, is this environment only taking something from him, or is it also giving him something that he previously lacked? At this point in the story, Niggle's transformation becomes more visible, but it is still unfolding quietly. There is no dramatic moment where he suddenly becomes a completely different person. Instead, change happens through daily discipline, structure, and the loss of control over his own schedule. First, Niggle begins to learn humility. Earlier in the story, he believed his artistic vision was the most important thing in his life. Now he is placed in circumstances where he cannot define his own priorities. He must accept limits. He must acknowledge that he is not the center of the world. This humbling experience begins to reorder his loves. Second, he learns responsibility. In the workhouse, tasks must be completed faithfully, whether they feel meaningful or not. Niggle begins to understand that real maturity involves doing what is required, not only what is inspiring. Responsibility becomes a form of moral formation. Third, he learns time stewardship. Before, Niggle wasted time through procrastination and distraction. Now time is structured. He must use it wisely. This teaches him that time is not merely personal property. It is something entrusted to him. From a Christian worldview perspective, this reflects the idea that life itself is a stewardship before God. Finally, he begins to practice quiet obedience. This obedience is not dramatic or celebrated. No one applauds him. Yet this quiet faithfulness is deeply transformative. He begins to act rightly even when there is no recognition or reward. Together, these lessons show that transformation is rarely glamorous. It is often slow, hidden, and shaped through discipline. But this kind of formation prepares Niggle for something greater, a restored vision of his work, his relationships, and his ultimate purpose. At this point in the story, Niggle overhears two voices discussing his life. These voices are deeply symbolic. They represent two realities that every human being must eventually face: justice and mercy. The first voice speaks with the tone of justice. Justice looks honestly at Niggle's life. It recognizes his failures, his procrastination, his disordered priorities, his reluctance to love his neighbor well. Justice does not ignore these things. It tells the truth about what Niggle has done and who he has been. From a Christian worldview, this reminds us that human life is morally meaningful. Our choices matter. We are accountable for how we use our time, our gifts, and our responsibilities. Justice affirms that good intentions alone are not enough. Real evaluation must take place. But then a second voice speaks, the voice of mercy. Mercy does not deny the truth about Niggle. Instead, mercy introduces compassion, patience, and the possibility of restoration. Mercy recognizes the genuine good in Niggle's desires, even though those desires were often misdirected. Mercy asks whether formation is still possible, whether Niggle can still grow. This moment is crucial because it shows that judgment in the Christian vision is not merely condemnation. It is also purposeful. It aims toward transformation. Justice reveals what is wrong. Mercy opens the door to what could still be made right. As you think about this scene, consider how both justice and mercy are necessary. Without justice, there is no truth. Without mercy, there is no hope. Tolkien uses these voices to help us see that real change happens when honest evaluation and gracious possibility work together. At this moment in the story, something very important is happening beneath the surface. Niggle has been disciplined. He has experienced correction. He has begun to change. But now we see that his progress is not rewarded because he has finally become perfect. Instead, the story introduces the idea of gentle treatment. This is a powerful phrase. It suggests that transformation does not end with harsh judgment or endless striving. There comes a moment when mercy enters the process. Niggle is not advanced because he has flawlessly completed every requirement. He is advanced because his heart has begun to shift. His priorities are changing. He is learning humility and concern for others. This raises an important worldview question. How does real grace work? In many cultural narratives, advancement comes through achievement. You move forward because you perform well enough. But Tolkien presents a different vision. Grace is not something Niggle earns by reaching perfection. It is something he receives as he is being formed. From a Christian theological perspective, grace is not a payment for success. It is not a reward for flawless effort. Grace is the undeserved favor that meets a person in the middle of transformation. It recognizes genuine change, even when the person is still incomplete. Notice also that grace does not eliminate formation. Niggle still needed discipline. He still needed to learn responsibility. But grace ensures that the process is not ultimately crushing. It becomes restorative rather than merely punitive. As you continue reading, watch how this gentle treatment prepares Niggle for what comes next. It shows that redemption involves both truth and mercy, both accountability and compassion, working together to reshape a life. At this point in the story, something deeply important begins to change in Niggle. Earlier, his greatest concern was finishing his painting, completing his vision of the tree before it was too late. His thoughts were dominated by anxiety about unfinished work and the fear that his efforts might never be recognized or completed. But now we see a shift. Niggle begins to worry less about the painting and more about Parish. This is not merely a change in focus. It is a change in the ordering of his loves. In Christian theology, repentance is not simply feeling sorry. It is a reorientation of the heart. It means turning away from self-centered priorities and turning toward rightly ordered love for God and neighbor. Niggle begins to see Parish not as an interruption, but as a person who matters. His concern moves from protecting his project to caring about another human being. This signals that his character is being formed through discipline and grace. This moment illustrates an important worldview truth. Vocation is never meant to exist in isolation from love. Work and calling are good, but they must be integrated with responsibility, humility, and service. As you reflect on this scene, consider how repentance often involves letting go of control, trusting that what we cannot finish ourselves may still have meaning in God's larger purposes. Write down evidence from the story that shows Niggle's priorities are being reordered. Now we arrive at one of the most important ideas in the entire story, the way real redemption actually happens. Many modern stories suggest that change comes through escape. If the character can just get out of a difficult situation, leave responsibility behind, or finally be free from limits, then life will be better. Other stories suggest that change comes through self-expression. If the character can simply be true to themselves, follow their desires, or assert their identity, then transformation will occur. But this story presents a very different vision. Here, redemption is shown as formation. Niggle does not become a new person by running away from difficulty. He is changed through structure, discipline, accountability, and eventually mercy. His priorities are reordered. His concern for others grows. His understanding of work and responsibility deepens. This is not a comfortable change. It is a slow change. It is shaped change. From a Christian worldview perspective, this reflects the idea that God often redeems people not by removing all hardship immediately, but by using hardship to reshape the heart. Formation involves correction, humility, and learning to love rightly. As you work in your groups, think carefully about two questions. First, who brings change to Niggle's life? Is it purely his own decision? Is it social pressure? Or is there evidence of a deeper moral or divine authority guiding the process? Second, what process actually transforms him? Look for signs of discipline, responsibility, cooperation, and grace. Be ready to explain not just what happens, but how the story believes real change takes place. Redemption requires formation. What kind of change begins in Niggle? At this point in the story, we begin to see that Niggle is not simply being rescued from difficulty. He is being reshaped by it. Earlier, Niggle was primarily concerned with finishing his painting and protecting his time from interruptions. His sense of purpose was real, but it was also self-focused and disordered. Now a different kind of change begins. Niggle starts to develop humility. He learns to accept limits rather than resist them. He begins to take responsibility more seriously, even when the work is difficult or unnoticed. Instead of measuring his worth by artistic completion, he is gradually being formed into someone who can serve faithfully and live with rightly ordered priorities. This is important for understanding redemption from a Christian worldview. Redemption is not simply escape from struggle or a sudden emotional transformation. Often, redemption involves a process of formation, a shaping of character through discipline, structure, accountability, and eventually grace. Niggle's desires are being reordered. His concern for himself slowly gives way to a greater concern for others and for what truly matters. As you think about this moment in the story, ask yourself, what specific attitudes or habits are beginning to change in Niggle? How do these changes prepare him for the restoration that comes later? Write down at least one piece of evidence that shows Niggle is being formed, not just relieved. As we come to the end of this section of the story, we need to slow down and think carefully about what Niggle has just experienced. His time in the workhouse has not been comfortable. It has involved limitation, structure, correction, and the loss of control. Yet something important has been happening beneath the surface. This leads us to an important question. How can discipline actually prepare a person for restoration? In many cases, discipline is misunderstood. We tend to think of it only as punishment or restriction. But in a deeper sense, discipline can function as formation. It can reorder our priorities, reshape our desires, and teach us to live within reality rather than within our own self-centered expectations. Notice what begins to change in Niggle. He becomes more attentive. He becomes more responsible. He begins to think about others differently. His sense of urgency about finishing his own project begins to give way to a quieter readiness to accept what is required of him. From a Christian worldview perspective, restoration is not simply the removal of difficulty. Restoration is often the result of being shaped through difficulty. The biblical pattern shows that God frequently prepares people for greater responsibility or deeper joy by first teaching them humility, patience, and obedience. As you reflect, consider this. What qualities must be formed in a person before they are ready to experience true restoration or fulfillment? Take a moment to write down one idea. Think about how Niggle's discipline is not the end of his story. It is preparing him for what comes next.